All right. So we're going to start off here by going through last week's Furtado exercises. Don't forget that your peer review of another student's Unit 1 Furtado exercises, that is due Wednesday by 11:59 p.m. Central Time. If you have any difficulty finding that peer review, let me know. Some students have had trouble. I'll just right now go ahead and let me pull up um, show you the easiest way to find it that I know of. Again, my screen's going to look different from yours, but if we go to the course and you come to the home page, you should have over here on the right some to-dos. Hopefully your peer review shows up over here. That's the easiest way to find it. There's another way for me to find it, but I have different links than you guys do. So if I go into assignments and I see these are all digital lessons. So if I come down here to quizzes, digital lessons, Furtado exercises, I click on Unit 1, I've got a button over here for the peer reviews where if I click this, it's going to show me everybody in the class. It's going to show me whether or not they were assigned a review. And the only reason why you wouldn't be assigned one is if your exercises for Unit 1 were not submitted on time. Basically at 11:59 p.m. or midnight Sunday morning, I guess, those peer reviews are assigned immediately. So if yours isn't turned in, you're not in that pool, and you yourself won't get one. Now, if you don't get assigned a peer review, you're not going to be penalized for not doing one. You'll receive a late penalty for not having your assignment in on time. But if you are assigned a peer review and it is not completed by 11:59 p.m. Central Time on Wednesday, then your Unit 1 this week, your Unit 1 Furtado exercises will be penalized 50%. So do make sure you complete those peer reviews. One of the the purpose behind the peer review process here is for you to compare your answers against another student's answers. And all you have to do is note the places where you have a different answer and then explain which one is correct and why it's correct. So if you have the exact same answers as someone else, well, then just state that. Just say we had no differences, great job, whatever. But if you do notice a difference, at least one of you is wrong. You may both be wrong, but you're probably not both right, unless there's more than one possible answer. So in that case, just explain why you answered the way you did, and if someone's wrong, explain why that is. Hopefully, there's not going to be a lot of those on the review. Hopefully, you'll have pretty much the same answers most of the time, because you both have learned well what's going on. But the idea there is to recognize the reason why something's correct. You may know intuitively what the answer is, but what these peer reviews do is they force you to think about why the answer is correct, and that's what we're trying to get out of that. So, little overview of what the peer review is and why it's important. If you are having trouble accessing it, these links here should be helpful. But again, I have a different screen than you do, so I can't see exactly what you guys see. And of course, I myself was not assigned a peer review, so I can't tell for certain where yours is going to pop up. Now, I guess it would be prudent. Let me find there we go. I guess it would be prudent for me to ask. I know Ben has a mic. Dustin, I don't know if you do. If either of you guys who are here in the chat, did you successfully find your peer review?
Yes, sir. There. If you'll go to your submission.
Yes. Let me pull this up so you can kind of walk me through where to go. So where would you go from the home screen?
So I would go. What I do is I go to modules.
Okay.
And then go to the Furtado exercises there.
All right.
And then in the top right corner, like of course, where yours says instructions, that's going to be where our peer review or our submission is found.
Right here.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
perfect.
where our document's going to be. And then in the top right corner over there, where you have speed grader, download submissions, peer reviews, um, that's actually going to be where our peer review is assigned, and you're going to see whoever's name you got.
Okay, perfect. All right. That's what I had kind of hoped. It was pretty much the same because if I click on this, it'll take me to a master list that has everybody. So my hope is that yours would appear somewhere over here.
Yeah.
So that's good to know, and hopefully, if anybody's having trouble when they watch this, that will have just walked them through. So there is, of course, a chance for someone watching this that, hey, you might have. Not gotten a peer review because again you turned your exercises in late. That's normal. You don't even have to worry about it. If you know you turned it in late, I mean, if you know you turned it in late, then you won't have one, so don't worry too much about it. But do check in with me. Like I said, if you think you should have a peer review and you don't see it, let me know. All right, so good enough with that. Let's go ahead and jump in here to the actual exercises. We're looking at A, B, C, D, G, and H of chapter 17. All right. So here again, what I do in these video conferences, again, this is after we've discussed any real questions anybody has. This is sort of like the default sort of way that we spend the time here. Is you have, if you look in the back of your book, now mine's an electronic edition, but yours will be in the back of the book. These answers to practice drills, you've got the answers. You don't need me to tell you what the answer is. What I'm going to focus on in these videos is what do I want to make sure you notice? What do I want to make sure you pay attention to? Is there any sort of hint or tip that I can give you that will make this easier? What are some places where students usually struggle? That sort of a thing. So I'm not going to give you every single answer here. You have that in your book. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try to point out the weird stuff. I'm going to try to point out the things that I guess I wish I had known when I was going through. So some of this stuff will obviously be review of what Futato has said, but I'm going to try to reiterate the most important things. And then whatever I don't cover, hopefully, I mean, you'll find that in the answer key. But at the end of this, again, if there are any questions left, if there's something I missed, you can, if you're here, ask me. If you're watching this later, send me an email, send me a text, whatever. Do not hesitate to contact me, ask me any questions. My job in this course, since I don't really have to teach much, I mean, the digital lessons and the textbook really do the teaching in an online situation. My job is to answer questions. My job is to help you guys get through this course as successfully as possible. So you're never bugging me, whether that's email or text or whatever. Just send me a question if you have it, and I'm happy to try to find a way. I might even make just a one-off video addressing that particular issue, because chances are if you have a question, someone else does as well. All right, so that said, what I'll start off with here is I want to point out that this is just sort of a helpful way. It's not 100%, but the vast majority of the time, if you get into a bind, this is sort of a quick way. This is more for sight reading, something that's going to help you read faster. Again, it's not 100%. If you rely on this all the time, there's a chance you might make a mistake here or there. But it's sort of a shortcut that I want to help you with. The rule, and again, even the rule has some exceptions, but the basic rule on whether or not a pronoun, especially here a demonstrative pronoun, is functioning attributively or predicatively as a predicate, the rule is whether it matches its noun indefiniteness. Now, there are three ways a noun can be definite in Hebrew, and the definite article is just one way, okay? So just because a noun lacks the definite article, that does not mean it's indefinite. A noun is definite if it has the definite article. A noun is also definite if it has, and I got to double check here because I'm teaching Hebrew 1 and Hebrew 2 at the same time. I got to remember where. I'm not sure if you guys learned this last semester or this semester. Yeah, possessive suffixes on singular nouns. If a noun has a possessive suffix, it is definite. That noun almost certainly will not have an article. But if it has a possessive suffix, by default, if I'm talking about my horse or my son, I'm talking about a specific horse or a specific son. And that's really all we mean by definite. We're not talking in general about horses or sons. We're not talking about some horse or some son. We're talking about the specific horse. We're talking about my specific horse. So the first way that Hebrew indicates definiteness is the definite article. But a second way it indicates definiteness is with a possessive suffix. So even if a noun with a possessive suffix lacks the article, it's still definite. Finally, any proper noun. So that's basically a noun that would be capitalized in English. Any proper noun is going to be definite as well. So if I wanted to say like, what's a proper noun? I'm trying to think of an exception, a proper noun that's not a name. So a name is always going to be a proper noun. So David, Jerusalem, Yahweh, all of these are proper nouns because they are names, but a proper noun is basically any noun that would be capitalized in English. A proper noun is by default referring to a specific type of noun. So if I say, man, why can I not think of an example of a proper noun that's not a name? If I say spring is here, spring is, again, that's the name of the season, so it's still another name. Let's do this together. I mean, we're live, this sort of thing happens. Let's just go for list of proper nouns in English and see what we get here. All right, so, I mean, honestly, all of these are names of something. That's a pretty short list, by the way. So let's see. 50 proper nouns. That should give me plenty to deal with. Wow, okay. I guess they're random. This this list has not been pre-scanned for appropriateness, but okay, maybe I'm just off on my definition of a proper noun. Maybe a proper noun is just a noun that is a name of something. So we can go with that. Anytime you have, it's not just a personal name, but a name of anything, we'll call that a proper noun. I mean, that at least is true. It is a proper noun. I'm not sure if there are other things that are proper nouns besides something that is a name of something, but we'll go with that. That is the third way that something can be definite in Hebrew. And those frequently, for example, names of people, they are usually not going to have the definite article either. But they are obviously referring to a specific individual or event, Christmas. That's the name of a day or a season. That is referring to a specific day or season. So you can see how by default this is specific rather than general, which means it's definite. Okay, all that to say, once we understand what definiteness is and how it's expressed in Hebrew, the rule for the function of whether this is a pronoun or an adjective, when something is functioning attributively, it will match the definiteness of its noun. So if this is a noun with a possessive suffix, or if this is a proper noun, it may not have the definite article. In fact, if this is a noun in a construct chain, it may not have the definite article. It won't have the definite article if it's a construct, but it may still be definite. So don't equate definiteness with the definite article. But once you've determined the definiteness of the noun, then check to see what the definiteness of the adjective or pronoun is. In this case, the demonstrative pronoun. In these cases, the definiteness will, I can't think of an exception, the definiteness will be marked by the definite article. Okay? But that's not always the case with the noun. So here, if we see a definite article on the pronoun or the adjective, that's a pretty good indication that we're looking at an attributive use. Okay? So here that would be the face, or I guess pe is mouth, the mouth, the this. Okay, that's a very literal translation, which, by the way, just let me get on my soapbox here real quick, is one reason why literal translations are not by default superior to more functional translations. Okay, if you open your Bible and it says the mouth, the this, that's very literal. That's not necessarily the better translation. Okay, so the mouth, the this, how do we make sense of this? Well, the agreement indefiniteness tells us it's attributive, so I would translate that as this mouth rather than this is the mouth, okay, which would be the predicative one. All right. So again, you'll have the actual translations through here, and you're basically told up front that these are all going to be attributive. But what I want you to notice here is that the reason they're all attributive is they all match indefiniteness. Now, you don't have to have the definite article for them to match indefiniteness, because pe may not be definite. If I just have peze, well, that could also be attributive even though there's no definite article, because they match in their indefiniteness. They're both indefinite, so that's still a match. Okay? Here's the shortcut that I want to give you. And again, this is not 100% of the time, but here's the shortcut. If the pronoun or adjective comes after the noun, if it comes after, then it's probably attributive. Okay? If the pronoun or adjective comes after the noun, then it's probably attributive. All right? If the pronoun or adjective is prior to the noun, if it precedes the noun it modifies, then if it precedes the noun, it's probably predicative. Right? So that alliteration there, or I guess alliteration is a vowel, but no, alliteration, that's the first letter sound, I think. Anyways, they begin with the same sound. Attributive comes after the noun. Predicative precedes the noun. Okay, we're talking about word order here. In that case, I would say 90 to 95% of the time that's going to help. So I use that for reading. Like if I'm trying to translate as I'm reading Hebrew, I'm not stopping to check the definiteness. I'm looking at what word comes first, and if the modifier comes first, then I'm thinking to myself, this is a predicative relationship. If the modifier comes after the noun, then I'm thinking to myself, this is attributive. All right, so that's basically what I want to tell you here about lesson A. And again, you can read all of the translations in the answer key, but that's what I want you to realize here. Now, I think it was A, B, C, D. Yeah, A, B, C, D, then G and H. Okay. So B, focus on predicate demonstrative pronouns. And again, you can replace this with adjectives, predicate pronouns. Honestly, up here, these demonstratives, there's no such thing as an attributive pronoun. I mean, these are attributive adjectives. When they function predicatively, they are pronouns. But if it's attributive, it's an adjective. So this mouth, this is an adjective there. It's a demonstrative adjective. This mishpacha, that's family. This clan, this family. That is a this family. This is an adjective. Okay, it's not a pronoun. When I get down here and I say this house, well, actually, this is the house. This is the house. This is a pronoun now, all of a sudden, because this is the subject. But up here, this mouth, this isn't the subject. This is an adjective. It's modifying which mouth? This mouth. All right, so, but either way, when it comes to adjectives in general, this also applies to demonstrative adjectives, when the modifier comes after the noun it's modifying, it's usually going to be attributive. When the modifier precedes the noun it modifies, it's usually going to be predicative. So here I've got this, the house, which because the modifier precedes its noun, it's going to be predicative. This is the house. Now, if you want to be a little bit more precise, you can check that against the definiteness. Here, ze does not have an article, so there's no reason to think ze is portrayed as definite. This gets a little bit tricky because technically ze is always definite because it's demonstrative. It's pointing at a specific one. It can't be indefinite, but it can lack the article, and that's what's happening here. Okay, so ze lacks the article. Habayit is definite, and so in that situation, we can confirm that this would be a predicative relationship. Now, if you look at some intermediate grammars like Waltke and O'Connor, or Arnold and Choi, or I think Juan and Maroka is probably more of an advanced grammar. But if you look at intermediate grammars and advanced grammars, they're going to get a little bit more nuanced in their explanation here, a little bit more exhaustive and precise, and they're actually going to mention that sometimes even this definiteness rule gets broken. Sometimes you'll have a mismatch in definiteness, or you'll lack the article here and you'll have an article here, but context really forces you to translate it attributively anyways. But those are very, very rare occasions. So I would say, just as a general rule for translation, context probably trumps morphology. Context trumps grammar. Context is king is sort of the slogan that a lot of translators live by. So context is really most important. Now, of course, grammar and morphology are part of context, but all that to say, in grammar there are always exceptions somewhere. So that's just, I want you to know that there are some tiny few exceptions, just in case you run into them at some point and you're like, well, wait a minute, they lied to me. Usually when we're talking about rules of grammar, we're talking in broad strokes. We're saying that this is predominantly the case. And so it is predominantly the case that when your pronoun lacks the article, but your noun has the article, in the case of a demonstrative pronoun, you're looking at a predicative relationship. That is predominantly the case, the vast majority of situations. And again, the shortcut is, if the modifier precedes the noun, then it is predicative. All right? So you'll see that all the way through here. This is the house. This is the wife or the woman. Ayla, these are the words. That is the way or the path. That is the kingdom. That or those are the horses. This is the land. These are the women or the wives. This is the king. All right. So you see that all the way through the disagreement indefiniteness. All right. So section C here. Again, you've got these answers. So I'm just going to go through here and point out that this preceding versus if the modifier precedes, it's predicative. If the modifier is after the noun, it's attributive. Just going through here. That also happens to line up with the agreement or disagreement indefiniteness. So here precedes disagrees indefiniteness. Here after agrees indefiniteness. Here after agrees indefiniteness. Here preceding, the modifier preceding disagrees indefiniteness. Here it comes after and it agrees. Here hazeh comes after and it agrees. Here zot comes before, it precedes and it disagrees. Here hahu comes after and it agrees indefiniteness. And then finally ha'ela comes after and it agrees indefiniteness. All right, let's look at the relative pronoun assure. Remember, you have to be very flexible in how you translate this relative pronoun. Generally speaking, when I'm sight reading, when I'm just translating as I read in Hebrew, I'm going to use a quick gloss for the relative pronoun. I'm going to try to think of the most flexible English relative pronoun I can for assure. And then once I've got a little bit more context, I can be more precise. So the most flexible relative pronoun that I usually use in English for assure is going to be which. Now, which won't always work, so I'll have to come back and revise it. So when I have Hamelech Asher Malach, that would be the king which ruled. Well, this would probably be the king who ruled. Okay? Now, it's also very important for you to know your relative pronouns in English well. If you're going to translate into English, you have to know English. You have to know English grammar, and you have to know what the relative pronouns are in English. You have to know when you should use which instead of that. There are differences when it's appropriate to use which versus that. I guess it's a little bit complicated of an explanation if you haven't heard it before, but it's the difference between the relative clause being restrictive and the relative clause being non-restrictive. If you can pull the relative clause out of the sentence and it doesn't change the meaning of the sentence, that is a non-restrictive use of the relative pronoun. And non-restrictive relative clauses use which. But restrictive relative clauses, where the relative clause actually defines and specifies its antecedent, that's when you use that. So if I were to say, the car, let's see, if I were to, okay, so let's say we go out into a parking lot. I see a car, I see a truck, and I see a bus. And I were to say something like, the car, which belongs to me, has been broken into. Well, if I take out which belongs to me and I just say the car has been broken into, which belongs to me doesn't change the meaning of the sentence. You can still understand the sentence the same way. I'm just giving you more information. The relative clause, which belongs to me, doesn't restrict the meaning of the antecedent, the car. It doesn't change the meaning of the antecedent. However, if we go out into a parking lot and we see 4 cars, and I say the car That belongs to me has been broken into. I'm saying that there are 4 cars. The one that belongs to me is the one that I'm referring to. I didn't need to specify that in the first instance because there was only 1 car. But now when we have 4 cars, I'm using my relative clause to restrict the meaning of the word car. I don't mean just any car here. I mean the one that belongs to me out of all of them that are present. Okay, so in that sense, the relative clause is restricting the meaning of the antecedent. It's restricting what I mean by car. In those cases where you have a restrictive relative clause, you usually use that. Okay, so if I go out into a parking lot and I say, the car which belongs to me has been broken into, and there's 4 cars out there, that's technically improper grammar. I don't want to say incorrect. It's improper English. Proper English would be the car that belongs to me has been broken into, right? And that again, that may not make a whole lot of sense. That's a lot of English grammar. But what I want you to understand is if you want to do translation well, obviously you need to understand the grammar of the language you're translating. We don't think a lot about the fact that you also need to understand the grammar of the language, the receptor language that you're translating into. That's very important. So, all of that to say, I know that's a big digression, but what I want you to understand is when it comes to the relative pronoun, in one sense, it's great that there's really only one primary relative pronoun in Hebrew. You don't have to memorize a bunch of different forms. But you need to know your English grammar really well. You need to know when you should use who versus which. You need to know when you need to use whom versus who. And you need to know when you ought to use that versus which. You need to know when it's appropriate to use each of these pronouns. All right, so as we go through here, again, my gloss for Asher is probably going to be which, because which is the most flexible. I can at least make sense out of the sentence if I use which. If I come through this sentence with who or whom, well, then it's not always going to make sense. It's going to be really confusing. But which is pretty flat. I can make sense of it most of the time. Excuse me. All right, so that said, the king which ruled should probably be the king who ruled. All right. The woman which she sent, shalacha. This is going to be she sent. It's interesting that I mean I guess it's just a coincidence. I guess it's just a coincidence that the woman is feminine singular and the verb is feminine singular, because this would not make sense to translate it as, if I translate ha'isha as the subject of shalacha, first of all, I expect my subject to come after my verb in Hebrew. General Hebrew word order is verb, subject, object. Now, it's not always that way, but when it deviates from that, it's usually for a reason, so like emphasis or something. But if I take ha'isha as my subject, the sentence no longer makes sense. I guess you could translate it something like, which the woman sent, but then you don't have an antecedent here. So this would have to be the woman which she sent, which should honestly be the woman whom she sent. All right, number 3, the prophets which they spoke. Okay. So what's going on here is we've got I confused myself. I did it right in number 1, the king which ruled, the king who ruled. And then what I should have said is the woman or the wife who sent. The thing that threw me off here is shalach is really a transitive verb. You send something. It has a direct object. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to translate or to use shalach without a direct object. So when I don't have a direct object, I have to assume that this is the direct object. So this could either be the woman who sent something unnamed, or it could be the woman whom she sent. As it is, I would translate this the woman whom she sent. When I come here, I could either have the prophets whom they spoke, but spoke is intransitive. Unless your direct object is the content of the speech, it doesn't make sense to speak prophets. So here, even though that's, technically an option, this makes more sense to be translated along the lines of number one, the prophets who spoke. Not the prophets whom they spoke, but the prophets who spoke. All right? Number four, that's an important thing. I'm kind of glad I stumbled over that because that's an important distinction to make here. You have to decide, is ha'isha the subject or the direct object? Well, shalach really kind of requires a direct object. And I've got a subject built in. So I'm going to go with this is the direct object, and I'm going to say the women who, or the woman whom she sent, whereas down here, Amar really doesn't take a direct object. At least it doesn't take prophets as a direct object. So here I'm going to say that the prophets is making the subject explicit. The prophets who spoke. And you'll notice that's why I translate I use whom here and who here. Because the women, or the woman, is the object here. And so in English, the relative pronoun for an object is whom, and the relative pronoun for a subject is who. So I use who with ha-nevi'im, because ha-nevi'im is the subject of Amru. All right? So number four, ha-kesef esher babayit, the silver which in the house. This would be a verbless clause in Hebrew, so we would supply the copula is, or the linking verb is, the silver which is in the house. Makomot esher yeshav, places. Now this is another sort of thing to be aware of. In English, the relative pronoun would be which. And we would say the places at which he dwelt or he lived. But I'm going to encourage you to expand. Again, it's the conversation about which is the more literal translation here. I'm going to give you two translations. You tell me what's more literal. Translation number one, places at which he dwelt or he lived, in which case I'm supplying at. It's not in the Hebrew. There's no bait preposition here. So I'm adding something to the translation. Or is number two more literal? Number two would be the places where he dwelt, or the places where he lived. So here, I'm not supplying an extra word, but I'm translating a relative pronoun with an adverb. Where is an adverb? Okay, so which one's more literal? They're both changing something. And that's just sort of a demonstration that sometimes literal would be places which he slept. Now, that's actually an improper translation because in English that would imply that the places are the direct object of the verb. But places aren't the direct object of the verb. Places are the location of the verb. Okay? And this is actually, I'm actually teaching an intermediate Hebrew course right now, And what I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to take a snippet of, oops, I don't want that one. I'm going to take a snippet of this right here. This is called multitasking. Because this is a great example of something we're learning about in intermediate Hebrew, which is various uses of the accusative case. Now, I'm not going to go into that here because we're not talking about cases or anything. But this is a difference between Hebrew and English that's really interesting. So if you'll allow me some patience here, allow me patience. If you'll give me some patience here, I'm going to, let's just put it here. Accusative, adverbial, accusative example. All right. So, anyways, all that to say, you wouldn't think to translate a relative pronoun as where, but Hebrew makes that an option because Hebrew uses its relative pronoun differently than we do in English. All right, and so flexibility in your translation is an important thing to have. You need to have a reason for giving a more functional translation rather than literal. We're not just going to be willy-nilly. We're not paraphrasing for the sake of paraphrasing. We need to have a reason for why we make the choices we have. But if you can give the reason, then you're justifying your translation. Okay, now that said, in first year Hebrew, we really try to focus on as literal of a translation as possible because we're more concerned with evaluating whether or not you understand the words you're seeing. And if you're giving me an interpretive translation, I don't know whether or not you understand everything you see until you explain your interpretive translation. And so on the quizzes, when you have to translate a sentence, unless you go through and explain the interpretive choices you've made, I'm relying on a literal translation to show me that you know what all the words are. All right, enough with that. Number 6 here, the gold which he took. All right. The gold here is going to be the direct object of lakach. Number 7, sacrifices which are upon an altar. This is indefinite, so I wouldn't say the altar. Number 8, the bread which he ate. Again, the bread is the direct object of the verb. And this would have been another good kind of like, additional requirement of this is designate whether the noun is the subject or the direct object, because that's really important for translation here. Number 1, the noun is the subject. Number 2, pretty obviously, unless you're talking about one king who ruled another king. But number 2, I think that the noun has to be the direct object here. And then number 3, it flips again. I think that the noun has to be the subject. So I think it's important to your translation to think through, have a reason for why you think this noun is the subject or the direct object. All right, number 9, banim. So this is sons which came out. So yatsa doesn't really, in the cow, doesn't really take a direct object. So banim would have to be the subject. So the sons who came out. All right, good enough. That's D. Let's move on here to G. All right, for the translations, I usually just pick the longest one and go with it. So let me kind of try to do, here, let's just do it this way. Cover our answers so we're not cheating here. All right, so number 5 looks like the longest one. I'll try to do this. If you've had elementary Hebrew with me before, you've seen me do this on the translations. What I'm trying to do here for you is model sort of a process for translation. Not necessarily step by step, but a routine that I hope that you can pick up on that will make translation easier for you. So when I come to a Hebrew sentence, the first thing that I'm expecting to see is the main verb of the sentence. It won't always be the main verb, the first thing there, but that's generally how Hebrew sentences work, is they'll start with the main verb. So if I'm expecting that, that will help me recognize weird verb forms a little bit better. So I'm anticipating a verb as the first word, but it doesn't have to be. So keep an open mind, but anticipate a verb. So here I've got ba'et. Now, if I'm anticipating a verb, I've got a lot of explaining to do. This is a very weird form. Technically, it could be a cal perfect stative verb of the root bait, ayin, tav. That's where we get that stative cal perfect is where we get the kamet sere pattern. But I'll just tell you right now, that's not what it is. Another possibility is that I've got, now we have not looked at the PL yet, we'll get to that later, but another possibility is that this is maybe an infinitive or an imperative of the PL of the root bait, ayin, tav. Again, that's not what this is because we haven't done PL yet. What this actually is this is a bait preposition on the word eight. Now, I'm almost certain 8 means time, but there are 3 words that I get confused all of the time in Hebrew, and 8 I get confused with eights and aish. And I'm pretty sure eights is wood, 8 is time, and aish is fire. Now, since going to my lexicon here, my vocabulary list, would reveal the answer anyways, I'm just going to sneakily try to move this, just so I can see number 5 at, first of all, it's going to be at that time because I've got hahi following it. So I think it's at that time. There we go. Okay, so 8 is time. So this is simply the bait preposition. It's got a definite article here. You can see the patak, there's no dagesh because the ayin rejects a dagesh, and so the patak lengthens to a kametz to compensate. So in that time, at that time, I should at this point just say in the time or at the time. At the time, the. And when you see this, you might think the she. Remember, the demonstrative pronoun, the far demonstrative pronoun, well, there's not really a far demonstrative pronoun in Hebrew. So it has to borrow the personal pronoun in order to make up for it. Why is it he instead of who? Because 8 is feminine, and it's gonna match 8 in gender, and so it uses the feminine pronoun. That is to say, this is at the time the that one. So at that time, now I get my main verb. Tidrosh. All right, so I'm going to assume this is a verb if I don't know it yet, because I'm still looking for my verb early, and so far I just have sort of a temporal clause here introducing the sentence. So now maybe I get to my verb. Okay, well, if this is a verb, this is the first thing I ask myself. How many letters is a verb supposed to have in its lexical form? It's supposed to have 3 letters. How many do I have? I have 4. Okay, so something is extra. And now I have to figure out what's extra. So, a lot of times I'll start from the end because that's usually the easiest to eliminate. So I ask myself, maybe the shin is extra. Maybe my root is tav dalit resh. Well, is shin ever used as a suffix for verbs? Never. So that can't be extra. Well, it's highly unlikely that resh is added as an infix. It's all most likely you've got a suffix or a prefix added. Rarely are you going to have a consonant added inside of a verb. So let's start first with the outer letters. Shin, we've already eliminated. Shin does not get used as a suffix for verbs. What about tav as a prefix? Well, tav is frequently used as a prefix in the prefix conjugation, which is the imperfect. Tav indicates either third feminine or second person. So, if I have an imperfect, that means my root is dalet resh shin, which is a root I'm familiar with. The root darash means to search for, to seek. It can mean inquire. So that works. And since it works, I'm kind of happy. As long as the meaning, search for, seek, inquire, fits the context, I'm probably safe to stop here. Now, I'll tell you this, if you're doing exegesis, if you're really digging into a text, eliminate all other possibilities. Don't just stop here. Really hammer this thing out and find out, is there anything else this could be? Because if we just assume that the first thing we guess is correct, without checking other possibilities, we may be missing, some interpretive options. But I'm going to take this tav as indicative of a cal imperfect. I said that tav indicates either third feminine or second person. When tav has no suffix with it, that's going to be either 3fs or 2ms. It's going to be singular. So this is either she will seek or you will seek. So I'm going to leave both of those as possibilities. I'm going to get a little bit more context and see if I can narrow that down. All right, so far I have, at that time, she will seek or you will seek. Seek what? Et marks my definite object, definite direct object. She will seek or you will seek Elohim, the Lord, the living one. Not the Lord. She will seek God, the living one. So at that time, she will seek or you will seek the living God, Bekol Libekha. Bekol is with all. Here bait is being used instrumentally. Will seek with all of your heart. Now, since I've got your here, a second person pronoun, that probably indicates that I should read this as a second person verb, which means it's you, masculine, will seek the living God with all of the heart of you, with all of your heart, and with all of the soul of you, or with all of your soul. So our translation, at that time, you will seek the living God. Chaim here is from Kai, but it's masculine plural to match Elohim. You will seek the living God with all your heart and with all your soul. Fatato, at that time you will seek the living God with all your heart and with all your soul. All right, so that's G. Let's take a look at H here. And Ben, if you're still with me, I'll let you pick which of these verses you want to take a look at, and we'll actually jump into the Hebrew text here.
Yeah, let's do Judges 4:14.
All right, so I'm gonna open up my Hebrew text. Let me find it here. All right, Judges 4:14 was it? Yes, 4:14. All right. Now, what we've got here in Futato is just an excerpt, but it helps. See, here's why I do it. In my electronic version, this is telling me that Beyadecha should be Sisera. Sisera is down here. So my electronic version gets this all jumbled anyways. But this is clearly not, this is relatively short compared to, hang on, compared to what I have here in 14. So this is a good opportunity for us to kind of wade into some unfamiliar Hebrew in order to find what Fatata wants us to actually look at. So I'm going to go through this, and I'm just going to call this pre-learning. I'm going to notice a few things that we may not have run into yet that are just sort of like heads up for later on. You know, we'll learn about this stuff later, but you'll get to see kind of a preview of it here. So Judges 4:14, the first thing I notice is I've got this Vav Patach Dagesh. Now, Vav Patach Dagesh sounds a lot like Hey Patach Dagesh, and Hey Patach Dagesh should immediately make you think of the definite article. Well, you can kind of think of this as the Vav definite article or the verbal definite article. It doesn't make anything definite. The function is completely different from what the definite article does. I'm just noting the similarity in the morphology, what it looks like. It looks very similar to what the definite article looks like. It's just got a Vav instead. Okay, when you see this pattern, Vav Patach Dagesh, attached to what looks like an imperfect verb, that is a very specific form in Hebrew. And that is a form that's used in narrative a lot of times to basically carry on past tense narrative flow. Now you'll note it's attached to an imperfect form. This is Amar, and the Tav prefix here tells me that this is either three, without a suffix, tells me this is either 3fs or 2ms, cal imperfect, because actually, yes, we have to have. We just did an imperfect. I was like, when do we learn about the imperfect again? But I know where. I've got too many windows open here. Yes. Cal perfect. Okay, yeah, lesson 11 was when we did the imperfect. All right. So I've got an imperfect here. What this Vav Patach Dagesh does is it sort of... This has been described in a lot of different ways and a lot of different grammars, and the way it gets described gets criticized a lot. But I think the simplest way to think of it is the Vav Patach Dagesh sort of inverts the expected time. So we usually expect the imperfect to point to future time. Well, when you see the Vav Patach Dagesh on it, that's going to reverse that. So instead of pointing to future time, this is actually saying, hey, what we're talking about happened in the past. So if Tomer is she will say or you will say, the Vav Patach Dagesh now makes this she said or you said. All right? Said what? Devorah. So Devorah here, this is actually an imperfect. Oh no! You know what Devorah is? Can you guess, Ben, what Devorah is?
I'm gonna assume it's Deborah.
Yeah. I got a little too fancy here. I'm like, that looks like an imperative or an infinitive construct form of debir. Of course, it would be in the wrong stem. So yeah, this is just Deborah. Okay.
Right.
So Deborah said, El Barak to Barak, Kum. Okay, Kum we haven't had yet, but this is basically the imperative form of what's called a hollow verb. Most verbs in Hebrew, amar, whatever, have 3 letters, 3 consonants, triconsonantal. But there are a group of verbs in Hebrew called hollow verbs where instead of 3 consonants, they have 2 consonants and a vowel letter. Okay, that's what kum is. Kum basically means get up, or come, or arise. It literally means to get up or to arise, but it's usually used as just an attention getter. So it doesn't always literally mean get up or stand up, Sometimes it's just a way of saying, getting someone's attention. Come on now. And so I often, because cum and come on sound so similar, I often use that as a mnemonic to kind of remind myself what it means. So cum, so arise, ki ze hayom. So ki here is either introducing a causal clause or some sort of explanatory clause, or it might be introducing like direct speech, but direct speech doesn't make sense because it would be followed by a verb of speech. We would expect ki after, amar or something like that. So this is probably giving a reason or explanation for why you should arise. Come, for this is the day. All right, so we've got ze and we've got yom. Ze is the masculine singular near demonstrative. Yom is day. Yom is definite. Ze does not have the article, so this is a predicative. And you'll also note that the ze precedes the noun it modifies. So, ze, this is the day. Again, I would say which, but since I know it's a day, I'm going to say maybe when. This is the day when, or you could just say this is the day that Natan, he gave or he has given. Who has given? Yahweh. This is the day that Yahweh has given what? Et marks our definite direct object. Sisera. This is the day that Yahweh has given Sisera beyadecha. In yad is hand of you. In the hand, into your hand, basically. All right. This is the day that Yahweh has given. And again, that's another thing to note here. Natan. We're so used to translating the Cal Perfect as simple past that we would usually translate this as he gave. Yahweh gave. But that doesn't sound really good in the narrative discourse here in English. So in English, we would probably use the perfect here. Well, the perfect is a perfectly suitable English translation of the Cal Perfect tense. It's another past tense. So this has happened. It is done. That's what the perfect means. The simple past just refers to an action that is set in the past. The perfect tense in English refers to an action that it emphasizes the completeness of the action. The action is done. It didn't just occur in the past, it's done occurring. All right? So this is the day that Yahweh has given Sisera into your hand. All right, hello. Now here, this hello, this hey hatef patak on here, this hey hatef patak is kind of like the Hebrew question mark. It's just, it comes at the beginning of the clause rather than at the end of it. So whatever's happening here, we're going to turn it into a question. So we'll just kind of pause on the hey for a while. We've got lo Adonai Yatsah. So Yatsah here is the Cal Perfect 3MS form of he came forth. So this would be Yahweh came forth. But we've got the lo. So Yahweh did not come forth. But then we've got a question mark. Didn't Yahweh come forth? Didn't Yahweh come out, come forth? Lifnecha, before you. Lifnei is literally it's like to the face of, but it means before or in the presence of. Didn't Yahweh come out before you or come forth before you? And here we've got again the Vav Patak Dagesh. So whatever this is, which is probably imperfect, or looks imperfect, we're going to invert the time expectation. So here, if I've got Yered, How do I parse yered? Well, how many letters is a verb supposed to have? 3. How many do I have? 3. Okay, great. Can I make sense of it? Well, oftentimes when I have a 3-letter verb, that means I'm looking at a Cal Perfect 3MS. Problem is, Cal Perfect 3MS would have a Kometz Patak vowel pattern, and this does not. This actually has a Sere Segel vowel pattern. Now, Sere Segel is very close to Sere Sere, and as we will find out eventually, when we add this Vav Patak Dagesh to a verb, it kind of pulls the accent back to the front of the word. And when it does that, it forces this sere to shorten to a segel. I know this is a lot of morphology that we haven't even covered yet. I'm just pre-exposing you to things we're going to see later. Okay, so this right here, we've got Vav Patak Dagesh on what is essentially Yered. Now, Yered, that Sere Sere pattern, oh my goodness, we're doing that this week, aren't we? One yod in the Cal Imperfect. Well, if you've read your Futato lesson so far, you might recognize this then. If not, this is very prudent pre-learning because you will see this week. All right, so here it is in action, proof that what you're learning is important and helpful. What happens with a one-yod verb? Specifically what's known as a one-yod vav, which means historically the root here was actually vav, resh, dalet, but throughout the history of Hebrew, eventually all of the verbs that began with a vav, that vav got replaced with a yod. And so when this verb gets conjugated, sometimes that yod's going to come back. But there are certain Hebrew verbs that have always begun with a yod. They weren't previously beginning with a vav, they've just always had a yod. Those are called true one yods. This is a one yod vav, and what happens in the one yod vav is, since it's not a true one yod, the yod doesn't stick around. The yod actually drops out altogether. And the yod that you're looking at here is not the yod of the first root letter. This is actually the yod of the imperfect prefix. The R1 yod has dropped out altogether. And so in order to compensate for the loss of this yod, the hirik that we usually expect under the imperfect prefix gets lengthened to a sere. And then to kind of match that, the theme vowel, which in the imperfect is usually either a holum or a patach, in the one yod vavs, the theme vowel matches the prefix vowel. So you get yered here for the Cal imperfect 3ms form. Like I said, we get yered here because we've got this vav patach dagesh feature that has pulled the accent toward the front of the word, and so sere now has to shorten into a segel. But this is a Cal imperfect 3ms form of yarad. Now, yarad, basically in the Cal perfect, means he went down. So in the Cal imperfect 3ms, it's going to mean he will go down. But when we add the vav patach dagesh, it inverts it. And so it is he went down. Now you might say, wait a minute, if we've got a Cal perfect that is used for past tense, why on earth would you invent this other thing that inverts the imperfect time to past tense? Why wouldn't you just use the perfect? You've already used the perfect up here. Why wouldn't you do it here? This is a feature of Hebrew narrative, and Hebrew prose in general, but Hebrew narrative especially, where the narrative action gets carried on by this particular form, okay? You can have perfects in here, but sequential action is usually going to be carried on by this vav relative, or that's what we call it, vav relative, but this vav patach dagesh, all right? So Natan here is a perfect, but it's not sequential to Deborah said. It wasn't like Deborah said and then Yahweh gave. Natan is used within the relative clause. But once we get sequential action, that is action after what Deborah says, so Deborah says this, and then Barak went down. That's why we start using this different form. Because in Hebrew, the narrative kind of gets propelled along by this specific feature that we're looking at here that we'll learn more about later on. All right, so what I want to kind of point out to you here is that there is a reason to use this special feature, even though you've got a perfect. This gets used in a narrative in a very specific sort of a way. But it essentially means the same thing as the perfect would. If you just had Yarad Barak, that would still be Barak went down. It's just this is more like, and then Barak went down. Mehar, this is men plus har, so from, okay, har does not have the article here. If it did, it would be min hahar. What we've got here instead is har tavor. So this is Mount Tabor, or you could say the Mount of Tabor if you want to see this as a construct. But we don't need the article because Tabor is a name. It's a proper noun, which means that this is definite, even though it doesn't have an article in here. So you could say either the mountain of Tabor or went down from Mount Tabor. Again, Vav Patak, we don't have a Dagesh, but we can't have a Dagesh because, oh, actually, this is a different thing altogether. This is not a Vav Patak Dagesh plus an imperfect looking thing. This is a Vav conjunction plus a perfect. All right. I know this gets confusing, but by the time we get to it, a lot of this stuff will make more sense. All right. So here, Barak went down from Mount Tabor, and Asar. Oh, this is actually a number. This isn't a verb. So Asar is a number. This is 10. Asaret is going to be 10 of. And then we've got Elephim. This is going to be 10,000. 10 of thousands would be 10,000 men, even though it's man, after him. So I think I'm reading that number right. Numbers can get a little bit tricky, but let's look it up here. Judges 4:14. And this is ESV, so it's not the... I'll tell you what. Let's go to a super literal translation. I usually have it up here. Let's just go. All right, Young's literal translation, Judges. Now, this translation isn't going to be good English. It's just being as literal as possible. And it's very old, hence saith. And Deborah saith unto Barak, Rise, for this is the day in which Yahweh has given Sisera into your hand. Didn't Jehovah come out before you? And Barak went down from Mount Tabor, and 10,000 men after him. There you go. All right. Any final questions or anything? Questions, anything to clarify, anything you want to discuss before we shut it down here, Ben?
No, I think you've pretty much covered it. It's you were talking back to the vowel switching and sort of that whole deal. I think we learned that in Hebrew 1 with
Okay.
with one noon verbs, I believe, and
Yes.
three
Yes.
olive. The same. So that's not a completely foreign concept
Right.
to me anyway. I don't know about anybody else, but
Yeah, and so the one yods they have a little bit different spin on what happens, but the idea honestly with these weak verbs, and unfortunately, the vast majority of verbs that you're going to run into in the Hebrew text, let me put it this way. If you take a book of the Bible and you count every time a verb appears, the percentage of verbs that are going to be weak versus the percentage of verbs occurrences that are going to be strong, you're going to more frequently run into a weak verb than a strong verb.
Yeah.
So the question is, why do we spend so much time hammering these strong verb paradigms and so much less time hammering the weak verbs? Well, the reason for that is the strong verbs give you the foundation you need to explain the peculiarities of each weak verb. And so what it really comes down to when you're looking at one noons and third hays and one yods is you're saying, what is the particular weakness that a noon introduces? Well, noons don't like to close a syllable when they're followed by another consonant. They like to assimilate into that consonant, which is what you see with the preposition men. Men, usually that noon at the end of men, that will usually assimilate into the next word. If the object of that preposition is a consonant, it'll usually, you'll get basically just mem, hirik, and then a dagesh in the next letter. Well, that's exactly what happens in the one noon verbs. That noon, since you've added a prefix in the imperfect, since you've added this yod prefix, the noon is now closing a syllable. And so it doesn't want to do that. It feels squished. And so it hides, you can think of it, it hides inside of the pay so that it doesn't get squished. That's just the particular weakness of a noon. And so if you ask, well, what's the particular weakness of a yod? Well, in the case of one yod vavs, it's a fake letter. That wasn't always a yod. That used to be a vav. And so when the prefix comes along, the yod knows it's a fraud, and so it bounces, it gets out of there, it hides, it runs away, or whatever, however you want to explain it to yourself. And as a result of the loss of that yod, the prefix letter is going to lengthen to compensate. And so there are ways of explaining all these changes to where they kind of start to make sense. But for some people, it kind of just depends on how your brain works. For some people, it's just easier to not know all the rules, but to just memorize the forms.
Mm-hmm.
And that's fine, but that means you got to memorize a lot of forms. For some people, it's easier to memorize all the rules, and then they can kind of figure out from whatever form they see how those rules apply. And if you can kind of get your head around that, what you need to know at the end of Hebrew 2, or at the end of elementary Hebrew 2, is you are now ready to begin practicing recognizing these forms in the text. Don't think that by the end of this semester, you're going to automatically recognize all these weak verbs, because you're going to be disappointed. You've learned all the rules you need to know, and you've learned all the forms of a particular verb, but now you're going to see those forms on different verbs, and you've never seen that before. So you have to practice that going forward. So this expectation that at the end of elementary Hebrew, I'm going to recognize everything I need to recognize, that's just a bad expectation to have. Now you have all the tools you need to practice recognizing stuff. It's going to take you another semester or another year to actually recognize these things immediately when you see them. So don't get discouraged when you're like, I'm still not recognizing these forms. The expectation isn't yet that you recognize them. The expectation is that you recognize the patterns, and you're going to have to start recognizing those in new verbs. And so if you see a new verb, don't beat yourself up for not being able to parse it right away. It's new. You got to detect the pattern, or you got to know the rules and figure out the rules. So that's what I try to do in that sort of translation procedure or methodology, is I try to start from scratch and say, hey, how many letters am I supposed to have? And if I don't have that number, then what's extra? Well, when do letters get taken away from a root or when do they get added to a root? And that kind of helps me sort of walk my way through the rules that will help me parse a form. So we'll do a lot more of that practice as we go through the semester. But my primary message in this, spiel here is don't get too discouraged just because you're still not recognizing things. This takes practice.
Mm-hmm.
All right, man. Anything else?
No, I'm good. Thanks a whole bunch.
All right. Well, we'll shut it down. You have a good week. And if you do run into any questions or any issues or anything, don't hesitate to let me know. All right.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
All right. Take care.